In Assyria's grand palace, a bronze throne waited, not for a king but for the condemned. When the fires beneath it roared, lies melted, flesh turned to ash, and truth was said to rise from the smoke. Yet as the flames judged others, no one knew the day they would turn toward the throne's creator himself. In Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved the cradle of civilization, the Assyrian Empire rose as a formidable force. Among its rulers, King Ashur-Nasir II stood out as a symbol of control, precision, and divine conviction. His reign, beginning in the early 9th century BCE, transformed the Assyrian state from a regional kingdom into a vast military and administrative powerhouse. Ashur-Nasir II inherited an empire weakened by rebellion and disunity. Tribal leaders had grown powerful, borders had blurred, and the central authority in Ashur had begun to waver. When he ascended to the throne, he made it clear that his rule would not tolerate defiance. He reorganized the military into a professional standing army, integrating chariot divisions, archers, and disciplined infantry. The campaigns he led were not merely wars of expansion, they were acts of calculated intimidation designed to restore imperial order. His capital, Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, was rebuilt into a monumental city. Massive palaces, towering ziggurats, and carved reliefs depicted his victories and divine right to rule. These reliefs were more than art, they were propaganda, showing Ashur-Nasir II as chosen by the gods to bring order through fire. His belief in divine justice would later define his rule in both governance and punishment. Trade flourished under his leadership. Assyria's reach extended to the Mediterranean, Anatolia, and even the borders of Egypt. The king established strict systems of taxation and tribute collection. Every conquered territory had obligations to the central authority, ensuring that resources and manpower flowed continuously to the heart of the empire. His administrative reforms turned Assyria into an efficient machine, with governors directly accountable to him. Ashur-Nasir II was not only a conqueror but also a builder of cultural identity. He revived old religious customs and redefined them to center on the king's divine role. Temples were reconstructed and rituals were standardized to emphasize the link between the monarchy and the Assyrian god Ashur. This connection between ruler and deity justified his methods, however severe, as sacred duties rather than acts of cruelty. While Assyria's influence expanded, so did its system of control. Conquered peoples were relocated, often forcibly, to prevent rebellion. Prisoners of war were used in labor projects or displayed as symbols of submission. The Assyrian chronicles describe these acts not as brutality, but as divine justice. For Ashur-Nasir II, suffering was not punishment, but revelation, proof of the god's judgment on those who defied order. His military campaigns were meticulously documented. The inscriptions carved on palace walls detail his conquests in cities like Carchemish and Arpad. Each campaign concluded with rituals of purification and tribute to the gods. The emphasis on ritual purity and fire became symbolic of his ideology. Fire cleansed, punished, and revealed. These beliefs would eventually shape one of the empire's most infamous forms of execution. Inside the royal court, loyalty was absolute. Officials and advisors were chosen for efficiency rather than nobility. The king personally oversaw the judicial system, ensuring that no verdict contradicted his authority. Judgment was swift, and appeals were rare. This rigid structure created both stability and fear, an empire that thrived on obedience and ritualized justice. Ashur-Nasir II viewed his throne not only as a seat of governance, but as a divine instrument. His palace inscriptions refer to it as the seat of Ashur's fire, representing both authority and divine illumination. To sit upon the throne was to channel the will of the gods. The bronze seat itself was often mentioned in royal rituals, polished and consecrated before major decrees or executions. Foreign emissaries visiting Kalhu wrote of the awe and terror inspired by the Assyrian court. The king's presence was heavily ceremonial. Every audience began with invocations to the gods and ended with a proclamation of truth. The concept of truth in Assyria was tied to divine revelation, not moral philosophy. Falsehood was considered defiance against the gods, and judgment often carried sacred symbolism. The royal architects of Kalhu constructed massive halls designed to amplify sound and reflection. When the king spoke, his words echoed through polished stone, reinforcing his perceived divinity. Fire altars burned continuously in the palace courtyard, symbolizing eternal vigilance and the consuming nature of divine justice. The king's obsession with purity through fire began to define his identity as much as his conquests. Ashur-Nasir II also commissioned massive bronze works, statues, reliefs, and ceremonial thrones. Bronze, to the Assyrians, was the metal of strength and endurance, unyielding and radiant like the sun. Its association with divine power made it the perfect medium for objects tied to judgment. This symbolism would later merge with the empire's evolving methods of execution, blending religious conviction with state control. The king's administrative system extended into the provinces through an intricate network of scribes and inspectors. Reports of disobedience were sent directly to Kalhu, often resulting in swift reprisals. Rebellion was treated not as treason, but as spiritual corruption. The empire's punishments mirrored its religious beliefs, purification through suffering and revelation through pain. Despite the harshness of his rule, Ashur-Nasir II maintained the loyalty of his army and governors. He rewarded loyalty with land, positions, and honor, ensuring that those who upheld order benefited from his rule. The balance between fear and favor became the foundation of Assyrian power. The empire functioned like a living organism, sustained by the king's vision of divine hierarchy. His inscriptions often described his role as the purifier of the nations. This title reflected his conviction that his campaigns and punishments were acts of sanctification. He saw his empire as a forge in which chaos was melted down and reshaped into order. This concept of fire as a divine purifier would grow from metaphor into method, a transformation that marked one of the darkest chapters in Assyrian history. The legacy of Ashur-Nasir II's rule was visible not only in his cities and armies, but also in his ideology. Justice was inseparable from faith, and faith demanded sacrifice. His empire prospered, his enemies were subdued, and his power seemed absolute. The rituals of judgment, once symbolic, began to take physical form within his court. In the years following his greatest military triumphs, Ashur-Nasir II turned his attention inward, toward the refinement of divine law. It was within this pursuit of purity that the concept of the flaming throne was conceived, a creation meant not merely to punish, but to reveal truth through fire. By the time the idea reached full form, it was more than a device of execution. It became a symbol of ultimate justice, a representation of the god Ashur's burning gaze. The empire that Ashur-Nasir II had forged through discipline and faith now stood poised to witness its ruler merge divine ideology with human punishment. The throne of bronze, heated by the fires of judgment, awaited its first test. The city of Kalhu glowed under the Assyrian sun, its towers shining like spears. The courtyards filled with soldiers, priests, and scholars, all serving under the king's watchful eye. The seat of divine truth, as the throne would soon be called, stood within the palace temple, gleaming in preparation. In the heart of the empire, order burned brighter than ever, and the fire that symbolized purity was about to take a far more literal form. As Ashur-Nasir II's empire stabilized, the machinery of his rule turned from conquest to consolidation. The Assyrian legal system evolved into a rigid hierarchy that mixed divine will with human judgment. Crime, rebellion, or heresy was not merely a violation of law, but an offense against the gods themselves. The king's word was regarded as sacred decree. Within this framework, punishment became ritual and execution became ceremony. In Kalhu, the palace workshops produced instruments not only of war but also of order. Artisans trained in bronze casting worked under strict supervision, creating sacred objects for temples and royal rituals. Among these, one artifact began to draw special attention. A bronze seat wider and thicker than any throne previously built. It was forged from a blend of copper, tin, and traces of iron, polished until it gleamed like sunlight. Its construction took months, and its design included channels beneath the seat to allow the passage of fire. This creation was known as the Seat of Divine Truth. Its purpose was not initially announced, but within the court, whispers began to spread. Some believed it was a ceremonial object used to confirm the innocence of accused priests or officials. Others suspected it was a new form of divine interrogation, a method to test truth through endurance. The king, however, remained silent about its function until the first trial was announced. Quick reminder, if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for upcoming historical content. The Assyrians believed that the gods revealed truth through suffering. Fire, being the purest element, was seen as a medium through which lies could not survive. When a prisoner was accused of betraying the empire or corrupting divine law, traditional execution was deemed insufficient. Instead, the flaming throne would determine their guilt. The accused would be seated upon it, and the fire kindled beneath would reveal whether they spoke truth or falsehood. Survival was interpreted as divine favor, death as proof of deceit. The first known account of this ritual comes from an inscription found in the ruins of Kalhu. It describes a captured provincial governor accused of conspiring with enemy states. The king presided over the trial himself, accompanied by high priests and military generals. The accused was stripped of his robes, anointed with oil, and seated upon the bronze throne. Beneath it, attendants lit fires of cedar and palm wood. The air filled with the scent of burning oil and the metallic heat of bronze. The ritual was carried out in complete silence. No cries, no pleading were permitted. The process was considered sacred, not punitive. The king stood before the altar, reciting hymns to Ashur, invoking the god to reveal the truth. Within minutes, the accused convulsed, his body consumed by unbearable heat. The priests declared that the gods had judged him guilty. His ashes were collected and buried beneath the temple as an offering of purification. Records from later years suggest that the flaming throne became central to the Assyrian concept of justice. It was used in trials involving treason, blasphemy, and corruption among high officials. The king's chroniclers described it as the ultimate test of faith and loyalty. In royal inscriptions, Ashur-Nasir II claimed that fire consumes falsehood but spares the faithful. The throne thus became both a political tool and a theological instrument, merging religion with governance. The bronze used in its construction was periodically renewed. After every major execution, the throne was cooled, cleaned, and repolished with oils mixed with incense. This maintenance was symbolic of continual purification. The priests claimed that the fire beneath it represented the divine breath of Ashur, while the bronze reflected his eternal light. The throne was not merely a seat, but a vessel of judgment, sanctified through each act of burning. Within the palace, the ritual chamber where the throne stood became restricted territory. Only the king, his high priests, and the royal executioners were allowed entry. The chamber walls were lined with carved reliefs, showing the god Ashur surrounded by flames. Beneath the artwork, inscriptions proclaimed that those who burn in truth shall rise in eternity, and those who burn in lies shall vanish from memory. For Ashur-Nasir II, the flaming throne was not an act of cruelty. It was an affirmation of cosmic order. To him, each execution reaffirmed his position as mediator between gods and men. The throne reinforced both fear and faith among his subjects. News of the trial spread through the empire, ensuring that even distant provinces recognized the king's divine authority. Rebellion declined not because of compassion, but because of conviction that divine fire would expose and punish deceit. In time, the throne's symbolism extended beyond executions. It became part of coronation ceremonies, standing as a visible reminder of the balance between truth and destruction. New governors and generals were made to stand before it while swearing oaths of loyalty. The fire beneath was lit during these oaths, and the king's priests declared that false promises would ignite the wrath of the gods. This blending of ceremony and terror kept the empire united through reverence and fear. Archaeological records suggest that the throne's chamber contained a complex ventilation system. Channels beneath the floor directed heat and smoke away from the king's position, allowing him to remain composed during the ritual. The design indicates advanced knowledge of metallurgy and airflow management. The throne itself may have reached temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius during execution, enough to cause fatal burns within minutes. Over time, variations of the ritual appeared across the empire. In provincial centers like Arbil and Nineveh, smaller versions of the flaming throne were constructed for regional trials. These replicas were often less ornate, but retained the same principle: fire as judge, bronze as witness. Each was consecrated through prayer and sacrifice before being used in official proceedings. The priesthood surrounding the throne developed specific rites to accompany the executions. The condemned were washed in scented water, their names inscribed on clay tablets that were later baked in the same fire used for the throne. The baked tablets were then stored in temple archives as records of divine judgment. These archives served as both administrative records and spiritual ledgers, preserving the idea that every lie and betrayal had been purified by fire. As decades passed, the flaming throne became a defining symbol of Assyrian authority. It represented an empire ruled by sacred law and divine justice. The people of Assyria lived under the belief that truth could not be hidden from the gods, and that the king, as their earthly representative, had the right to expose it through flame. Within this framework, fear functioned as faith. The empire's stability rested on the conviction that divine truth was absolute, and human suffering was merely its reflection. The bronze throne, glowing with sacred heat, stood at the heart of Kalhu, a silent monument to an ideology that equated pain with purity. By the later years of Ashur-Nasir II's reign, the throne had judged dozens of officials, priests, and rebels. It had become inseparable from his identity as ruler. The man who once built empires with armies now maintained them with fire. Beneath the shine of bronze and the sanctity of ritual, a philosophy had solidified, one that placed divine truth above human mercy. The throne of fire stood ready, its purpose fulfilled and its legacy secured. Yet the power it embodied would soon begin to consume the very order it was meant to preserve. The empire that worshipped the flame would eventually feel its heat from within. In the final years of Ashur-Nasir II's reign, the empire he had forged through conquest and fire began to reveal the consequences of its methods. The flaming throne, once revered as a sacred instrument of truth, had grown into a symbol of fear and mistrust. Officials who once swore loyalty under its heat now whispered in secrecy. The belief that divine justice burned only the guilty was no longer universally accepted. The priests, once devoted to the rituals of purification, began to question their own roles. Many feared that the throne had become corrupted by overuse, its sacred fire tainted by political ambition. Records from later Assyrian chronicles describe how the throne was used not only for heretics and traitors, but also for those who displeased the royal court. The line between truth and convenience blurred, and divine justice became a tool of survival. Whispers reached the capital that even governors loyal to the king dreaded being summoned to Kalhu. The ritual of fire, once rare and solemn, had turned into a spectacle of submission. Each trial reaffirmed the king's authority, but each also deepened the unease among his subjects. Fear ensured obedience, yet it eroded trust. The throne that symbolized divine truth now cast the shadow of tyranny. As Ashur-Nasir II aged, his conviction hardened into isolation. The palace at Kalhu, once a center of art and administration, became a citadel of silence. The king's counselors grew cautious, offering only words that pleased him. Priests performed rituals automatically, their faith reduced to repetition. The bronze throne remained polished, but its glow reflected an empire losing its moral clarity. One final account, preserved in a later Babylonian tablet, describes the last known ritual of the flaming throne during Ashur-Nasir II's lifetime. A young military commander was accused of hiding tribute from the royal treasury. The trial was brief, the sentence predetermined. The fire beneath the throne burned fiercely as the condemned was seated. Yet witnesses reported that the heat spread unexpectedly, igniting nearby draperies and engulfing the chamber in flame. The king, though unharmed, was forced to abandon the ritual. The priests declared it an omen, that the gods had turned their fire upon the throne itself. Following that event, the throne was said to have been dismantled and buried within the temple grounds. Its remains were sealed under layers of stone and ash. No further records mention its use. The era of judgment by fire quietly ended, replaced by more conventional forms of punishment. Yet the image of the bronze seat, glowing with divine heat, lingered in memory as both symbol and warning. When Ashur-Nasir II died, his empire remained vast but restless. His successors inherited his conquests, his architecture, and his ideology, but not his unshakable faith in fire. The flaming throne had achieved what he intended. It had enforced order and revealed truth. Yet in doing so, it had also consumed the reverence that sustained his rule. In Assyria's history, his reign endured as both a triumph of power and a lesson in the peril of believing that truth must always burn.